I am very happy to welcome again Dr. Simard. Thank you so much for spending some of your precious time on a Sunday to talk with us. We really appreciate it. I'll just make sure that you are pinned here. There we go. Yeah, just to give a little introduction to Dr. Simard, we have all read the book, but um, yeah, I'd just like to give you a little intro. So Suzanne Simard is a professor of forest ecology at the University of British Columbia and author of the book that we have all read, Finding the Mother Tree. She is a pioneer on the frontier of plant communication and intelligence. Her current research investigates how complex relationships among forest organisms contribute to forest resiliency, adaptability, and recovery. Suzanne has published over 200 peer-reviewed articles, presented at conferences around the world, and has influenced a wide array of documentary films and increasingly popular media. So we're so grateful to have you here today with us. So I have a few questions, yeah, unless you want to have something to pop in there.
Well, I'll just say that I'm coming here. I'm in Nelson, British Columbia. I'm on the territory of the Sinaiaks, the Ktunaxa, and Silk Nations. And the work that I've done actually encompasses many nations across British Columbia. There are 203 First Nations in British Columbia. I've probably worked on about half of the territories. So just to say that, and please ask me anything.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that. So the first question is, I think there are a lot of ideas out there around what makes nature valuable and what makes different species valuable. I think some would say nature's value lies in what we can take from it. Others might say, we should conserve nature, but maybe in a way that allows us to continue kind of unsustainable consumption patterns, like with carbon credits and things like that. Others might say it has an intrinsic value and should be protected for its own sake. So just to start us off, I'd love to hear you just reflect on what makes nature valuable to you and why you think nature is worth protecting. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that we are nature ourselves. We are interdependent, and inside of nature, we are nature. So if we feel like we and all the species that we relate with, which is the entire world, then if we think that's important, then it's important. Um, and I would say that we have people as ever since there have been people we've been interacting and influencing forests all over the world, and vice versa.
Mhm.
And yes, this idea of exploitation versus conservation, there's even a third way to look at it, which is how we've interacted with our environment, I guess. In that we have had, and I know that most people, especially today, we think of our humans as having somewhat of a negative impact on nature,
Mm.
if I can call it that. But actually, we have had hugely positive influences as well. That there are so many stewardship practices, tending practices, way that we get food, the way we cultivate food, the way that we look after the resources, if you will, or the sources, has been very positive until the last few hundred years, when our population has gotten so large that we are having quite a large impact. But I'd like to sort of flip it on its head, that that we are, so two things: we are nature, and two, we've had such a positive influence on the wealth that is provided by our environment. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, I think that's such a powerful reframe and really challenges us to, yeah, think a little bit differently about how we interact if we are part of the thing.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, so the second question is, so at the Canadian Biotechnology Action Network at CBAN, as I mentioned, we examine the risks of genetic engineering for environment and society from many different angles.
Mhm.
And as we see it, a lot of risks come from not recognizing complexity. Um, and we are really concerned, I think, following along in that line about the idea of releasing genetically engineered trees and other genetically engineered organisms into the wild, which is something that is kind of on the table now in society. And one of the reasons that we organized this book club is to think about and talk a little bit about what genetically engineered trees could mean for us and for forests.
Mhm.
So we're just wondering, as a forest ecologist,
Mhm.
in light of the insights from your research, if you have any thoughts about what genetically engineered trees could mean for forests, or what are some questions that we should be asking when we think about genetically engineered trees?
Yeah, it's a big topic. I have not worked with GMO trees myself or genetically engineered trees myself. I have a lot of cautions just come up in my mind right away.
Mhm.
So one thing we know, around the world is that as we have influenced forests in the last century very dramatically through harvesting forests, um, through converting forests to managed plantations, in industrial plantations. So these are not locally managed forests, but forests that are managed on large scales. And of course, in Canada, the predominant method for doing that is to clear cut and plant trees. And and largely until the last decade, I guess, it's been largely monocultures. And monocultures doesn't mean GMO, it just means that planting back one species. Um, and even a monoculture has a lot of genetic variety in it. And that I know that the people, the geneticists who have, really uh, been the scientific backbone for creating seedling nurseries, seed lots, and so on that we plant out, that they have a lot of integrity in ensuring that these populations we put out there have genetic variety. Um, at the same time, though, it's not just genetic diversity, it's also species diversity that matters. And what I have found in my research, and this is playing out around the world, is that when you have single species plantations, that there's a lot of risks associated with that. And so in British Columbia, about, I don't know, 15 years ago, I did a study of lodgepole pine, which is one of the dominant species planted in British Columbia. And it would be also in Alberta, I would suspect, that under warmer conditions as climate is changing, if you have single species plantations, that there's a lot of infections that happen in those. That's what we
Mhm.
found. We found, that we had about 50 different kinds of insect and pathogen infections in these plantations, and that in warmer, drier climates, it was worse. And so that was a red flag for me. And I think that we see that in other places in the world, whether it's eucalyptus plantations or Pinus radiata or Douglas fir that's been moved around the world. When you have those single species places, that you have that risk of losing that species to a whole bunch of different things.
Mhm.
Diversity matters. Species diversity matters. In right now, what we're seeing within these monocultures is high risk of wildfire.
Mhm.
So, we tend to plant fast growing species that for pulp and paper and uh, products, they happen to be the most flammable species as well. Eucalyptus is hugely flammable, and it's planted not in Canada, but in many other places around the world. And it's like a killer tree in a sense that it's got
Mhm.
very flammable. Lodgepole pine has got a lot of resins in it, makes it very flammable. Um, so so there's lots of precautions around single species plantations that moves over into the GMO conversation, because genetically modified trees, and I don't know a lot about it. I know that when I was in graduate school, they were talking about creating the first one, which was this hybrid poplar that was like this super tree, um, that was highly productive. And I know that there's been lots of tree breeding to create very fast growing species, or breeds, I should say. They're not GMO trees, but they're bred for that. And they do grow extremely quickly. I was just in Estonia, and I could see where they had been planting some of these hybrid spruces that their growth rates were unbelievable. Um, so but still not GMO. But what I worry about with a GMO tree is that, again, it'll be, the temptation will be to plant it as a monoculture. And so there's the monoculture thing that goes along with it. Then there's the whole risk of escape of those genes into the wild. And then,
Mm-hmm.
and so what will be the impact on natural populations, which is always the concern, no matter what GMO thing you're creating. And then what are the knock-on effects into the ecosystem? You know, the pollinators, the you know, the decomposers. There's like so many species that depend on those trees, which are the primary producers. They fix photosynthase, they have all their symbionts, and they have their pollinators. You put this thing out there, what happens to those? So I have a lot of concerns about it. And you know, we've got tons of trees out there. We can breed them, which is not GMO. We can create diversity and ensure diversity in our using the natural populations. There's no shortage of diversity out there. It's so I have the big precautionary principle up there for me. I know that with the chestnut blight, they did create I think it was a GMO tree that was resistant to the chestnut blight, and then they had to backtrack on it because there's problems with it. Thank goodness they caught that before they released it into the wild. So yeah, I guess, I mean, there probably are arguments for it. I guess if I'm to try to argue on the plus side for it, one thing that I would argue, or that I can see, is that, you know, we really need forests to deal with climate change and our biodiversity crisis in a huge way. Like what we do to forests affects those things massively. What we do, you know, right now, scientists are estimating we have between a 25 and 50% carbon deficit in the world because of what we've done to land use change, deforestation. And so in order to draw down that CO2, what we do in forests plays a big role in that. And so we need forests on our landscape. We need to be working with them and tending them. If species are, you know, at huge risk of disappearing for a variety of reasons, and we need trees out there. Maybe there's a role in making sure that there are forests on the landscape. But honestly, as I hear myself saying that, a whole bunch of red flags are just going up. You know,
Yeah.
there's many ways to do this without GMO. Okay, that's a
Yeah.
long answer.
No, thank you so much for that. I was just going to say it's a very generous answer, and it flags a lot of the things that have come up for us as well
Okay.
around the precautionary principle, around complexity, around so many questions that just
Mhm.
don't get answered when we investigate kind of very narrowly. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Um, yeah. The next question I have is, so as you have experienced for many decades, I think science and policymaking often kind of clash. I think your book discusses a little bit some of the resistance that you've encountered to research
Mm.
results or your research questions, even.
Mhm.
And it sounds, in reading Finding the Mother Tree, like maybe people are a little bit fearful of embracing complexity and what the implications of that might be for policy making. So we're just wondering if you can reflect on how embracing complexity makes you feel. Is it scary? Is it hopeful? Does it have the power to kind of change these systems that can feel a bit unmovable at times? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to get over, if we're afraid of embracing complexity, we need to get over that really fast because complexity is the very source of life, right? Our systems, forests are complex systems. They're complex adaptive systems. And as we've simplified them in an industrial way, that loss of complexity comes back at us right away. So yeah, we should be embracing the natural complexity, which natural is changing all the time because climate is changing. So our role as people, as natural part of these ecosystems, we have a huge role to play in helping these systems adapt, change, retain their complexity through our cultivation practices or however we tend these forests. Um, and to ensure that complexity is as good as it can be to help resist damage, to be resilient, to be robust, to help mitigate climate change. We need them to do that. And the best way is to ensure that they are complex and diverse and that they're reflecting the natural conditions that are there. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, Great bid for complexity. Um, the next question is just kind of a more action-oriented question, maybe. So, many people who care deeply about forests and trees, I think might not always feel particularly well equipped to take on kind of an active role in trying to
Mhm.
make change. Maybe people feel like, "Oh, I don't know enough, or I'm not enough of an
Mm.
expert, and I'm scared I'm going to say something wrong."
Mhm.
And you address this a little bit, I think, in especially the epilogue of Finding the Mother Tree, but also
Mhm.
throughout. So we're just wondering if you have advice or
Mhm.
encouragement for people who might feel compelled by these ideas we're discussing, but maybe have a hard time kind of finding their role in the
Yeah.
struggle.
Yeah, I mean, I think we all need to play a part in this because we're all affected by what goes on in our forests. It's becoming more and more evident um, every year. As I said, what we're doing in forests affects all of our lives every day. In Canada, we just went through the worst fire year in the history that we've been recording fire. And scientists have calculated or estimated that our fires last year in Canada contributed 23% of global greenhouse gases. It's just in that 6-month period. And that 6-month fire period, it wiped out 20 years of times two of the mitigation plans put in place by our federal government.
Mhm.
And so, and really, why did the fires erupt in the way they did? And why is it in the last decade it's been getting, instead of a summer, we call it a fire season now. The language is changing as
Ooh.
we are becoming aware of this. Uh, and there's really a couple of big reasons. One is climate is changing, and that's had positive feedbacks from what we've done in forests over the past 100 years. They say, that about 20% of greenhouse gas emissions are from land use change, which means, deforestation, conversion to agriculture, a whole bunch of things that we've done. Um, and and it's probably even more than that is my estimate, because as I've done in the Mother Tree Project, and my research is showing that actually when our current modern forestry practices are contributing massive amounts of CO2 to that equation. And that the wildfires now, and I know I'm putting out a whole bunch of stats here, but I
Oh,
think it's
yeah.
important that we know this, that the forestry and the wildfires is now 3 times all other sources of emissions from Canada. Um, so we've swamped it all out through what's going on in our forests. Okay, so it's a result of climate change, and it's also a result of how we've managed our forests. So, this massive clear cut, well, for one, we've sort of, the way we do forestry is we sort of hand over the forest management to big um, corporations, and what we do in our provinces, which govern that they're very much lockstep with the corporate industrial approach to this, and the people have not had a lot of say in it. We just sort of are going. We're living mostly in an urban or rural environments. We don't really see what's going on in forests, and so it's really been controlled by these large moneyed interests. And what's happening is the conversion of these primary forests to planted forests with reduced biodiversity and great big carbon emissions and increased wildfire risk. And so we all, as the people, need to really get involved. So I would say our lives depend on all of us getting involved. That we need to look around and put pressure on governments to change. And governments will always resist change and industry because there's a lot of financial interest in this. And there's a whole bunch of industries that flow out of that, the timber industry, the herbicide industry, the fertilizer industries. There's many, many industries. And so there's a lot of resistance to change. But as people, we need to mobilize around this because it's probably the most important factor in how Canada is sitting in the world stage with respect to greenhouse gas emissions and biodiversity loss. So yeah, we need to be active and not be afraid. And I have to say my own activism. So I became more activist by writing Finding the Mother Tree, because I'm a scientist, and I sort of, I could sit in the academic world and just publish my papers and not really have said any, like, who cares, right? As soon as you step into the activist role, there's a lot of pushback. So I've experienced huge pushback, and it's hard, but it's important and necessary, that we all, you know, don't be afraid and do this, because our lives depend on it, and certainly our kids' lives do too.
A powerful rallying cry. Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
sharing that. Oh, um, I think we're coming close to the end of the time that we have with you, but I'd just like to maybe ask a little bit about some of the exciting projects that I hear you have coming up. Maybe there's a children's book, maybe there's some other things, but we'd love to hear what's coming
Yes.
next for you.
Yes, thank you for asking. I am working, yeah, on 3 books right now. I guess one is a children's book, that is based on Finding the Mother Tree. Uh, and one of them is a kind of a sequel that I have a, I don't really have a title for it yet, but it's about, you know, my work with the nations, in British Columbia, and how we're trying to work to, protect our forests and restore them, because there's been
Mm,
such a big impact on them. What this means, how we can, embrace Indigenous knowledge systems, to help steward these forests into better condition. Um, so that's what the new book is about. And then I'm working on a third book, which is called The Secrets of the Grandmother Tree. That's
mm,
the working title. And my agent, Doug Abrams, who, as a writer himself, has worked a lot with Jane Goodall and Desmond Tutu and various famous people. And we're writing a book on the forests of the broader world, not just forests of Canada, but of the Amazon and the temperate forests across North America, to just try to elevate for a broader audience, this these different way of looking at forests as connected systems, as whole systems, as communicative systems, living systems, not just things.
yeah.
So yeah, that's what I'm
Oh,
working on.
that is so exciting.
Thank you.
As you have a lot of work ahead of you, but I'm so excited that, these connections are being made with Indigenous sovereignty, with global issues and approaches to forestry, and also making this more accessible to the next generation. I think that's so wonderful.
Thank you,
Um,
Caitlin.
yeah. Um, so I think that's it in terms of the questions that I have for you. We're so grateful that you were able to join us. It's a really wonderful discussion, especially on a Sunday. So you can feel free to sign off as we continue into our smaller breakout rooms. But yeah, we're just all so grateful for your work, and we can't wait to see what's next.
Great. Thank you so much, Hoa. Thank you, everybody.